Next we have Dozer's Pyramid, and this is a hilarious visual pun if you grew up in the 80s, which none of you did. But Dozer himself will have this step pyramid built. He had an entire funerary complex built. Imhotep is the builder for the king, council, and high priest. Basically an architect, a well-educated man who's going to play a number of roles and is initially responsible for creating the step pyramid. Now, the funerary complex has a temple building, courtyards, many dummy structures, all of which are enclosed by a huge stone wall. The stone wall would separate the sacred from the profane. It would represent that we are crossing into something of sacred importance. And they actually had a temple there, the pyramid is seen, as the physical temple to worship the deified dead. Remember, the pharaoh is Horus when he's alive and is going to be Osiris when he dies. And what we're going to see is this use of the stepped pyramid. Now, the four corners face the four cardinal directions, similar to a ziggurat. The difference is there is no cella on top. This is not an artificial mountain to raise a temple to the gods. Rather, this is going to be effectively an artificial mountain raising the spirit of the person buried in it to the gods. And effectively what it is stacked mastabas. And in fact, we can see several phases here where it was built. So we see an initial mastaba being built, and then they built a series of mastabas over it, creating the initial step pyramid. And then we get the larger step pyramid. You can imagine Dozer going through life going, hey, yeah, let's make it bigger. Or Imhotep maybe suggesting to him, hey, let's make this larger while we're at it. There's no reason to keep it, the same as every other well-off Egyptian. And what we get is this very grandiose royal tomb. Here we're inside of it, and it's the oldest stone structure that still exists in Egypt. This would assist the pharaoh in rising to the heavens, and here we're looking down the shaft into the burial chamber. We also see the first stone columns. Although they are engaged columns, these are not freestanding, the Egyptians will develop those later on as well. And they look a lot like reeds or papyrus existing in that space between the water of the Nile and the land, just like it does, cattails do on rivers and lakes today. This is important because the reeds or the papyrus become a symbol of transition, in this case from this life into the afterlife. So these reeds are going to be really important and get across that same idea of transition that we tend to think of when crossing over, as it were. And the structures that we see here have no structural function. They are purely decorative at this point, but they will become structural as things develop. Now, the obvious comparison is looking at a ziggurat versus a pyramid. Again, both of them create an artificial mountain. That's a similarity. However, there is no one buried in a ziggurat. It exists to hold up a temple, whereas the step pyramid exists to house the body as well as perhaps a small chapel that would allow for the continued worship of the deceased pharaoh. There would have been priests there. By the way, this entire precinct is made up of, as I said, dummy buildings, including bakeries, granaries, breweries, and other structures. Whereas the ziggurat is simply the temple. The temple at the top, the artificial mountain leading up to it. So very different ideas behind them, although the form is very similar. And where does that form come from? Why is it so universal? Well, how many of you played in a sandbox? You piled up sand, you went, oh, look, it creates a pile, which looks a lot like a pyramid. Yet sometimes things are a lot simpler than we tend to like to think about.